right, so today I'd like to welcome you to the Eisenhower Presidential Library's virtual monthly Lunch and Learn series. I've been really excited about today's program. I've been wanting to share our exhibit, the National Archives exhibit in Washington. And so today we have a very special speaker. Corinne Porter is here to talk to us about the Rightfully Hers exhibit that she curated for our flagship museum in Washington. Corinne, please take it away.
Thank you, Dawn. And hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about the Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote exhibition. And as Dawn said, I'm a curator at the National Archives Museum in Washington, D.C. I've been with the National Archives since 2007. If you're curious, my educational background, I have a Bachelor's of History from Western New England College and my Master's of Museum Studies from Johns Hopkins University. So before I start talking about Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote, I thought I would just talk really briefly about the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I know a lot of you are regular attendees for these Lunch and Learns, so you're probably a little bit familiar with this, but the National Archives, we like to call ourselves the nation's record keeper. And most people know the National Archives in Washington, D.C. as the home of the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, which are on permanent display in the National Archives Museum in our rotunda, which is what you see pictured here on this slide. But we also preserve, protect, and provide access to all of the permanent records of the federal government. And they document many of the most important milestones in American history, which of course includes the 19th Amendment. So when I began developing Rightfully Hers, I quickly realized that many people had actually never heard of the 19th Amendment or women's suffrage before. And some people weren't even aware that women only won the constitutional right to vote 100 years ago. Those who did know a little something about women's suffrage, from my experience, kind of tend to picture something like the image you see here, with a narrative that goes with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul leading the charge. Women took to the streets to demand their rights. They marched down city boulevards and picketed the White House gates. For the crime of peacefully protesting for their rights, these heroines were arrested and jailed, where they endured horrific conditions and abuse. Nevertheless, they persisted until women finally received justice on August 18th of 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified and women won the vote. And now there is truth in this, of course, but as is so often the case, the story that we think we know about major historical events is not generally the full story. And images like this, with all white, mostly upper and middle class women, don't give us the full picture of who was fighting for women's voting rights and what it took for them to succeed. A bigger issue, however, that I encountered is the broad misunderstanding that the 19th Amendment gave all women the vote. In fact, millions of women across the country were already voters when the 19th Amendment passed. Many women, however, also remained unable to vote after 1920. So clearly there is a little bit more to the story than pictures like this can tell us. So in order to do justice to the legacy of the 19th Amendment and the generations of women who fought for their right to vote, and to ensure that our exhibit was relatable to our museum visitors, I determined that this exhibit couldn't just be a 19th Amendment story. It needed to be a story about women's voting rights struggles more broadly. So Rightfully Hers offers a much more inclusive retelling of women's struggle for the vote, which reflects the diversity of women and strategies engaged in the struggle to win the vote for 1/2 of the American people. And to do that, we actually have to begin with a little civics lesson, because in order for the story of women's fight for the vote to make sense, we have to understand where the right to vote comes from in the first place. To begin, there isn't a citizen's right to vote in the United States. That's not even the case today. The Constitution, when it was originally drafted in 1787, made no mention of qualifications for voting, and powers not reserved to the federal government by the Constitution were left to the states. Over time, the Constitution has been amended to limit states' power to exclude certain groups of Americans from the right to vote, like women. But the power that state governments have to determine voting qualifications for their residents dramatically shaped women's struggle for the vote, and it continues to be a major factor in voting rights today. One other thing about the Constitution is that it is really hard to change it. A few years ago, for another National Archives exhibition, actually for celebrating the 225th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, we tabulated all of the efforts that had been made to amend the Constitution and found that there have been more than 11,000 attempts that were made, but there are only 27 amendments to the Constitution, which really gives you a picture as to how high that bar really is to change our Constitution. More than 650 of those 11,000 attempts were efforts to pass a women's suffrage amendment. So the first time that the 19th Amendment, as it is written today, was actually proposed in Congress was in 1878. But at that time, it never even made it to the floor of the Senate for a vote. And for 42 years, that same amendment was introduced at every session of Congress and either ignored or voted down before it finally passed and ultimately became our 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So what did it take for the 19th Amendment to finally pass? To begin, it took more than 70 years. And now the received wisdom has traditionally been that the birth of the women's suffrage movement happened in 1848 at the first Women's Rights Convention in American history, which was held in Seneca Falls, New York. However, historians today are starting to argue that the origins of women's suffrage are much earlier and really much more grassroots and dispersed. But for our purposes, I'm actually going to pick up with the end of the Civil War, when women suffragists, many of whom were also abolitionists, hoped that they might secure their right to vote while Congress considered what the rights of newly emancipated slaves should be. And this petition that you see here is a petition for universal suffrage, meaning that the right to vote should be universal to all U.S. citizens. It's actually the earliest document that's on display in Rightfully Hers. It's from, and as I'm saying it, I'm like, oh, is it? I think it's 1868. And if you look on the first few lines, first few signatures on the petition, you can see that it was signed by some of the most well-remembered women suffragists to history, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and I think a line or two below that is Lucy Stone, of course, among other women. Unfortunately, those women and other women suffragists were left disappointed when the 14th and 15th Amendment prohibited states from denying the vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but extended no voting protections to women of any race. This defeat really divided women suffragists. Some refused to support the ratification of the 15th Amendment, especially if women, and by this they meant white women, were denied the vote. And it got so ugly that it ultimately split the women's suffrage movement into two separate factions. And so for a time, it was a couple of decades, the women's suffrage movement was composed of two separate national organizations pursuing two separate strategies. One that was focused on women winning voting rights at the state level, and the other one was focused on winning the vote nationally through a constitutional amendment. Neither was particularly successful at winning new voting rights for women on its own, and eventually the two factions merged together after a couple of decades. It was actually 1890, to form the largest national women's suffrage organization in the country, which ultimately numbered more than 2 million women strong. Some suffragists, in the meantime, didn't let the fact that they didn't have the right to vote keep them from showing up at the polls and trying to cast their ballots anyway. Susan B. Anthony was one such woman, and she was famously arrested along with 14 other women for illegally voting in 1872. And this is an order to the U.S. Marshal to arrest Susan B. Anthony. Anthony, however, was not the only woman who did this, or her, her other conspirators. The year before Anthony's arrest, Marianne Shadd Cary, the first African-American woman newspaper publisher in North America, had attempted to register to vote in Washington, D.C., along with 63 other women. However, they were not successful at registering. And hundreds of other women from California to Maine attempted the same strategy. Not because they thought they could trick their way into the polls, but because they wanted to force a legal ruling on whether the 14th Amendment, which provides citizens equal protection under the law, granted them the vote. The question did make it to the Supreme Court, but the court ruled unanimously that the Constitution did not guarantee a citizen's right to vote, and that states could restrict voting rights to just men. So the legal path to the vote turned out to be a bust. So why was it so hard? Why did it take so long for women to gain traction in their fight for the vote? Clearly, male politicians did not support enfranchising women, but a lot of women didn't as well. In fact, anti-suffragists of women who were opposed to the women's suffrage organized and lobbied politicians just as vigorously not to give women the vote as pro-suffrage women did to press for their place at the polls. Of course, this begs the question, why on earth would women oppose their own enfranchisement? And to start, the more than 70-year fight for the vote also marked a period of dramatic social change when women became increasingly active outside of the home and traditional ideas of gender roles began to shift. To some, the very notion that women belonged in the public sphere was perceived as dangerous and frightening. They feared that women's political participation would corrupt their moral virtue and disrupt the social order. And to give you an idea of what exactly they feared, I'm just going to read a short excerpt from an anti-suffrage petition that is quite long, so I wasn't able to include it on this slide. It was actually signed by more than 850 women in 1872, and it was displayed in the Rightfully Hers exhibit. So among the arguments these women made, they argued, again, quote, because these changes must introduce a fruitful element of discord in the existing marriage relation, which would tend to the infinite detriment of children and increase the already alarming prevalence of divorce throughout the land. And that's the end of the quote. And I don't know about you, but I certainly, every time I read that quote, think what those women would make of the divorce rates today. And also, my husband and I think every time I voted, have gone to the polls together and have never encountered any marital strife. So, but there's also more to the resistance to women's suffrage than that. While women had not been very successful at gaining ground in their fight for the vote, by the end of the Reconstruction period in the South at the end of the 19th century, former Confederate states had been very effective at suppressing the voting rights of African American men. Southern politicians feared that if women got the vote, that would include Black women, and if that happened, they believed that it would be impossible to sustain Black men's disfranchisement. So debates over women's suffrage were driven, at least in part, by racial attitudes. And I want to emphasize that this was not just limited to the anti-suffrage movement either. This anti-suffrage postcard that you see here from the Georgia Association opposed to women's suffrage, it is pretty pointed in its arguments against, for why they want people to vote against women's suffrage. Specifically, you know, how clear they make that they are opposed to it because they want to maintain white supremacy. But there is also a petition in Rightfully Hers from Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the largest woman suffrage organization in the country, who also appealed to Southern Democrats to, you know, if you want to maintain white supremacy, why not do so honorably by enfranchising women, and then white women voters can help you with that. So I just wanted to make that clear. Race-based arguments were also made not only whether to support or oppose women's suffrage, but also over whether or not women should get the vote by a federal amendment or through state action. So there were kind of two layers going on there. But despite the fierce opposition to women's enfranchisement, women were also slowly gaining ground. And I just want to quickly share my favorite, very unexpected story that's in the Rightfully Hers exhibit that I had absolutely no idea about when I started working on developing Rightfully Hers, which was the story of the first women voters in the United States. Which were actually women in New Jersey beginning in 1776. So when New Jersey wrote its first state constitution, which I believe it did even before the Declaration of Independence was penned, there was no mention of sex when it with respect to voting qualifications. There was just a property requirement. And so women who met that requirement, which I want to be clear, was not, you know, many women, primarily wealthy and single women, because married women generally did not have the right to own their own property. That was their husband's right at that time. But the women who did meet that requirement could and did vote for the first 30 years of the Republic until New Jersey, in 1807, under the Constitution, changed its voting laws and restricted the vote to just white men of property. So at that time, women as well as free Black men lost the vote, and for New Jersey women, they did not regain it until the 19th Amendment was ratified 113 years later. But after New Jersey women lost the vote in 1807, It wasn't until 1869 that Wyoming Territory gave women equal voting rights with men. Wyoming also became the first state after New Jersey to give women the vote when it achieved statehood in 1890. In fact, only states west of the Mississippi passed women's suffrage until Illinois gave women partial voting rights in 1913. And here on the East Coast, I think we tend to assume that all progress kind of flows east to west. But I love how the spread of women's voting rights really subverts that assumption. So many states, when they made women voters, gave women equal voting rights with men. But in other instances, women only got what is known as limited or partial suffrage, like in Illinois. And that means that only certain women could vote in certain elections. So one of the most curious and interesting records that we have in Rightfully Hers is this patent drawing for a gendered voting machine. And I'm sorry, it's kind of, all the text is oriented sideways so that you can actually see the patent drawing. But if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that the patent was issued in August of 1910, which really speaks to the fact that, some women are, securing the right to vote, more than a decade before, and in some cases decades before the 19th Amendment was ratified. But certainly if you were a jurisdiction or a state that had only limited or partial suffrage, you have to manage two different ballots every election day, which certainly is a challenge, right? So this invention for a gendered voting machine was, a solution, a proposed solution to that. And it has a separate entrance for women and men. So if you kind of look at the left-hand side of the voting booth on the page, I'm not sure if you can easily see it, but at the top there's a door on a turnstile, and on the left-hand side of the entrance, it says ladies, and on the right side, it says gents. And that door is connected to a complicated system of gears and levers. And if you're a woman, you entered through the left-hand side, and the door would operate those gears to lock down the ballot measures that women were not allowed to vote for. And of course, if you're a man, you enter through the right entrance, and that door would make all of the options on the ballot available to you. I think it would have been easier just to give women equal voting rights with men, but that is not what some jurisdictions chose to do. So as states slowly began to pass women's suffrage, suffragists intensified their lobbying efforts on all fronts. State-level campaigns to win women full or partial voting rights were stepped up where success looked promising. Enfranchised women pressured their elected representatives to vote for a federal amendment, and suffrage leaders fervently lobbied the president and Congress to do the same. So the gradual growth in the number of women voting is actually really critical to the ultimate success of the 19th Amendment. Without the vote, women really only had their First Amendment rights, freedom to assemble, the right to petition, to advocate on their behalf. And women used those rights very effectively to not only press for the vote, but to promote other reforms as well. But without the vote, women had little power to make the government act on their demands, and no recourse that they were ignored. It's not like they could vote men out of office, and women knew this intimately. So it's important to understand that women did not just fight for the vote because they believed it was a fundamental right as citizenship, as important as that is, but also because they needed it. In my research for this exhibit, I looked at hundreds, if not thousands, of petitions from women that reveal the economic, the legal and social and physical harm that they faced as non-voters. So women fought as long and as hard as they did, not only because they wanted the vote, but because they needed that political empowerment to protect their families, their communities, and themselves. So let's return to our marchers. As greater numbers of women joined the fight for the vote, suffragists began to stage large and dramatic parades and processions in cities and towns across the country, which brought unprecedented visibility to their cause and also helped to gain tremendous public support. One of the most consequential marches happened in 1913 in Washington, D.C., when approximately 5,000 women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue the day before Woodrow Wilson's first presidential inauguration. It got ugly, however. The mostly male crowd encroached on the women to the point that the procession really came to a standstill. And the women were heckled and spit upon, and in some cases, even physically assaulted, while the police, who were supposed to be there providing crowd control, just looked on. There was a huge outcry over how women were treated, including congressional hearings. And although they are not pictured in any of the photographs from the march, we also know that women of color participated in the DC march as well. One woman who was there was Marie Bottineau Baldwin. She was a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, and Baldwin, who was in law school at the time, marched with other female lawyers in the parade. Alice Paul, who was the organizer of the DC March, however, attempted to discourage Black women, especially, from participating. Ultimately, Paul was overruled and Black women joined the procession. However, they marched mostly in segregated units. One woman who refused to do so, however, was Ida B. Wells Barnett. And Wells Barnett traveled to Washington, D.C. from Chicago to participate in the suffrage march as a delegate from the state of Illinois. And she famously refused to comply when she was ordered to march at the back of the parade with other African Americans, and instead marched with the Illinois delegation as she intended. So African American women and men played a really crucial role in the struggle for women's suffrage. They formed a robust network of Black women's clubs that actively worked to win the vote for women, as well as promote other social reforms. However, as racial tensions mounted in the movement, some white women suffragists increasingly discouraged or excluded Black women from their activities. Some did so because they feared that including African American women in their cause endangered their chances of winning the vote, which was the reason that Alice Paul acted the way that she did. Other suffragists held racist beliefs and preferred a segregated movement. But African American women suffragists refused to accept this discriminatory treatment, no matter their reason. So Wells Barnett is one of six suffragist spotlights that are scattered throughout the Rightfully Hers exhibits. You know, the National Archives has billions of pages of records, and it's almost an embarrassment of riches sometimes when we're curating exhibits. But unfortunately, one of the challenges that I encountered curating the Rightfully Hers exhibit is, since we are the repository of the records of the federal government, those records reflect who was in the government at the time those records were created, and also who they were primarily interacting with. And in both of those cases, during this time period, that the answer is primarily white men. So, you know, we had a goal to really ensure that Rightfully Hers reflected the diversity of the suffrage movement as it really was at that period of time. And so, unfortunately, sometimes our records didn't, you know, didn't bear out the way I'd hoped. We have lots of records from Ida B. Wells Barnett as an example. She was also a civil rights activist, but none of them happen to relate to her, you know, agitation for women's voting rights. So I came up with this idea to share, you know, a kind of broad spectrum of women who played important roles in the fight for women's voting rights through these suffragist spotlights. And so I just wanted to quickly mention the other women who were featured. So first is Mabel Pinghua Lee. She was a Chinese immigrant who marched for women's enfranchisement, even though she herself was barred from becoming a US citizen. Under the Chinese Exclusion Acts at the time, Asian descended immigrants were banned from naturalizing. And therefore, she remained unable to vote when New York State adopted women's suffrage in 1917 and after the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. Rose Schneiderman was a major force in New York's labor community who used her powerful oratory and skills as a union organizer to rally working class support for women's suffrage, which proved really critical in turning women's fight for the vote into a mass movement. And Adelina Otero Warren was an influential Mexican-American suffragist from the state of New Mexico. And she was especially effective at engaging with Spanish-speaking women and men to gain critical support for women's voting rights. And she also led a relentless campaign to keep pressure on New Mexican state legislators until they voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper in Mississippi when she began her struggle to register to vote, and she persisted until she was successful, and then thereafter dedicated herself to facilitating voter registration among other African Americans, for which she received repeated threats on her life. In 1964, Hamer challenged the all-white political establishment in the state of Mississippi in nationally televised testimony that proved pivotal in the struggle for African-American voting rights in the U.S. South. And last, Vilma Martinez was a leader in the Mexican-American civil rights movement during the 1970s, and she played a critical role in expanding voting rights protections for Spanish-speaking citizens and other language minority voters from discrimination at the poll. And I just want to mention that Hamer and Martinez were voting rights activists who fought for the vote after 1920, but any woman who fights for the vote is a suffragist, even if the suffrage movement is or women's suffrage movement is no longer active. But we're going to return at this point to the struggle for the 19th Amendment and the earlier part of the 20th century. So we have women marching by the thousands, petitioning by the millions, and women are voting in increasing numbers with every election. So finally, suffragists have some real momentum behind their cause, and then the country declares war against Germany and enters World War I. And just like the conclusion of the Civil War, women suffragists are once again divided over what to do. Most suffragists feared that fighting for the vote while U.S. soldiers fought abroad would be viewed as unpatriotic. And so they stopped publicly agitating for the vote and directed their energy to supporting the war effort. And I just want to call out because I was so excited to be able to include them in this exhibit. You can see this is a big kind of glass case, and on the right side we've got a couple of Red Cross uniforms that women who volunteered with the Red Cross during World War I war, and they're stunning. And so I was really excited to include them in the exhibit as part of my interpretive piece around the role of women's wartime service in the women's suffrage movement. The more militant branch of the suffrage movement, however, which I always try really hard to emphasize, is really a small minority of women suffragists. They were led by Alice Paul and persisted in their public protests during the war. They were the first Americans to picket the White House. You probably may have heard of the Silent Sentinels. That's what they called themselves. And they openly criticized the president for fighting a war to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, end quote, while women at home lacked full citizenship rights. The Wilson administration did not respond kindly to this, and the picketers were arrested, jailed, and subjected to deplorable treatment in prison. And although their protest activities were not popular with many suffrage leaders or with the public, Americans were nevertheless appalled that government authorities would jail women for demonstrating peacefully for their rights. So collectively, women's contributions to the war effort, sustained political pressure, and numerous state suffrage victories that had significantly increased the number of congressional seats representing women voters was finally enough to turn the political tide in favor of women's enfranchisement. And on June 4th, 1919, Congress passed a joint resolution proposing a women's suffrage amendment be added to the Constitution. But I said that amending the Constitution is really hard, and so suffragists' fight for their long-sought amendment was not quite over. For a proposed amendment to become part of the Constitution, it not only has to pass Congress by a two-thirds majority in both the House and the Senate, but it also has to be ratified by legislators in 3/4 of the states. And for the 19th Amendment, that was a grueling process to secure state ratifications, which culminated in Tennessee. So Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment came down to a single vote cast by Harry Byrne. He was a 24-year-old freshman legislator, and he was originally opposed to women's suffrage and intended to vote nay on the measure. However, he promised his mother, Feb E. Byrne, that he would vote for ratification if his vote was needed. And when it came time to vote on the 19th Amendment on August 18th, 1920, he kept his promise to his mother, and the measure passed by a single vote. So with Tennessee's ratification, the 19th Amendment received the requisite number of state ratifications to become the law of the land. It took 3 generations of relentless political pressure to win this landmark voting rights victory that resulted in arguably the most dramatic expansion of the electorate in American history. But I want to take a closer look at what the 19th Amendment actually says. So this is just the first sentence of the amendment, which says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So in effect, the 19th Amendment won women the vote. But if you read it, it is not an affirmative statement that women have the right to vote. It just says that a citizen's vote cannot be denied because of sex. And I understand that might sound like I'm splitting hairs, but there's nothing in the amendment that prevents states from denying women the vote for other reasons. And so for that reason, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was not a victory universally enjoyed by all women. So before I conclude, I just want to touch on a few of the ongoing voting rights struggles that the Rightfully Hers exhibit tells after 1920. First, the 19th Amendment does not apply to citizens that lived in US territories like Puerto Rico, or women who lived in the Federal District of Columbia. So for Puerto Rican women who by 1920 were US citizens, they faced another 15-year fight before the Puerto Rican territorial legislature gave all adult women the right to vote in 1935. In the interim, literate women secured the vote in 1929, but it took until 1935 before all women gained the right in Puerto Rico. And residents in excuse me, and residents in the District of Columbia who have never enjoyed the same voting rights as residents in the states. And so it was through piecemeal legislation throughout the middle part of the 20th century that district residents gained some voting rights, including the right to vote for president. But today, residents of Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. still lack voting rights and voting representation in Congress that is equal with United States citizens that live in states. Oops, sorry about that. So the 19th Amendment was also did also not extend the vote to women who were not yet recognized as citizens. Although there is not a citizen's right to vote in the Constitution, citizenship is generally a prerequisite to vote. And so in 1920, this included some Native American and Asian immigrant women. It wasn't until 1924 that all Native Americans were granted U.S. citizenship, and Asian immigrants were largely prohibited from naturalizing until changes to immigration laws in the middle part of the 20th century lifted those restrictions. Even as citizens, though, Native, Asian, and other minority Americans often faced discriminatory barriers to voting that were similar to those experienced by African Americans in the Jim Crow South. So let's pivot to what is, I think, the most well-known voting rights struggle that continued beyond 1920, which was the fight against racial discrimination experienced by African American women and men in the South, which culminated during the Civil Rights Movement. As I already mentioned, after Reconstruction, Southern states had really effectively disfranchised Black men. And these discriminatory laws and practices kept many Black men from voting and also barred many Black women from the polls after the 19th Amendment was ratified. While targeted at African Americans, many of these measures also kept many poor and poorly educated people of all races from the polls. And a disproportionate number of those folks were women. So I love how this booklet so clearly identifies many of the discriminatory measures and laws that Southern states employed to prevent Black people from voting. So they include poll taxes, which are fees or charged to register to vote. All white primaries, which obviously impacted what candidates would ultimately run for political office. Unfairly administered literacy tests and civic understanding tests, and of course, threats of economic retaliation and brute violence. African American women and men risked their lives and livelihoods to fight, just as Fannie Lou Hamer had, at the local and the national level to secure their right to vote. They won landmark voting rights victories in 1964 when the 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax for national elections, and in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act outlawed many of the discriminatory practices that had disfranchised Black voters for decades. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted to prevent racial discrimination in voting. And as a part of that, the law included a provision that required federal oversight of changes to voting laws in states with a history of voter suppression. However, in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, struck down the formula that was a part of the law that was used to determine which states were required to clear changes to their election laws with the Department of Justice. And that pre-clearance provision, therefore, is currently unenforceable until Congress chooses to pass a new formula, which it has not done to date. So as 1/2 of the people, women have been an important electoral constituency since they secured their right to vote. Political campaigns from all parties at the local, state, and national level have certainly recognized women's significance ever since. And campaigns often develop strategies targeting women voters. Some of you may have experienced some of that targeted campaigning yourselves. And women voters, whether they be Republican, Democrat, Independent, or committed to a third party, have been proud to show their support for their candidates. Like the fabulous woman, whoever she was, who wore the Ike dress, which the Eisenhower Presidential Library was so kind to loan for the Rightfully Hers exhibit. So like Mrs. Fresdahl, who is pictured here, I hope you will all honor the legacy and sacrifice of the generations of Americans who fought to open the polls for themselves and for millions of other Americans by casting your ballot every election day. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you all so much for your time. I look forward to answering any questions you have. I did just want to quickly mention here that the original closing date for Rightfully Hers, if any of you were contemplating traveling to Washington, D.C. to visit, was January 3rd of 2021. Obviously, the pandemic has significantly impacted the museum. And so I don't know at this point what the ultimate closing date for Rightfully Hers will be. That will have to be determined as things begin to open up and we resume normal operations. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm sure that the archives through archives.gov and all of our social media channels will be sure to blast that out. So I'm going to stop sharing my presentation at this point, and I can answer any questions.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you for that. Our exhibit that was in conjunction with your Rightfully Hers exhibit has been delayed as well. And so we're looking forward to installing that sometime in the future. So maybe you can come see an exhibit in Kansas one day. So we have, I would love that too. Do we have any questions? I've been monitoring the chat box and there hasn't been any typed questions in. So if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, I'm sure we'd have a great conversation around it. Sometimes it takes twice to unmute yourself. I don't explain it. I don't understand it. Corinne, I was really pleased that you were able to talk to us about the specific way that the African American women you know, intersected with this and participated in an appropriate fashion given the situation at hand.
Yes, I mean it was really important, as I said, really important, and it's, you know, this is where it's interesting with archives, because and I kind of in this like centennial moment that we're in, there's been a lot of effort to go out and search for evidence of Black women's engagement in the suffrage movement. And, you know, they were there. It's just, you know, the women who kind of wrote the history of women's suffrage didn't necessarily include their involvement. And, you know, where those records that survive that kind of document their activities have also kind of gone kind of undiscovered and out of sight. So one of the, I mean, it was always a goal of Rightfully Hers and really of every, you know, kind of major institution. I was really fortunate to get to have some conversations with curators from other museums that, you know, pulled together really fabulous exhibits about the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage. You know, but it's as so much, you know, with, you know, whose story gets told, you know, and who's been remembered to history. You know, it's kind of, this centennial has been a great opportunity to kind of shed light on parts of the full story of the fight for the vote that have, you know, have gone, not forgotten, but not necessarily remembered to history up until this point.
Did you, seems like I remember that you created some sort of a video tour, virtual tour of the exhibit?
I did. So for those of you who have not heard enough of my talking, there are video tours of me in the Rightfully Hers exhibit of varying lengths. There are a couple of shorter videos that the National Archives produced, and you can find those on, I don't remember the exact URL, but if you go to museum.archives.gov and visit the exhibits page, you'll find the Rightfully Hers webpage. But I also gave I think it's about a 45-minute video tour of Rightfully Hers for American Artifacts, which is on one of the C-SPAN channels. And so if you go to, you're going to hear a lot of the same content, but if you want to kind of see it in the exhibit, that video lives on the C-SPAN website somewhere.
And didn't we, the National Archives, create a lot of educational support? Is that available for everyone as well?
Yes, and I wish I had one of our education staff, because they've done so many different education programs. It's like, you know, I haven't been able to keep up with what they've been doing, but certainly through, thank you so much, Samantha. On the women's rights page, there's also archives.gov. I think it's like /women. There are a ton of resources. There you go. So if anyone has anything specifically that they're looking for, you know, please feel free to reach out. docsteach.org, which is also a National Archives website, is a great resource, especially for anybody who is a teacher or maybe having to, you know, do teaching from home and they want some like lesson plans and primary source material to, you know, there's a ton of resources there as well for more school-aged kids and educators.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask another time if anybody has any questions. Perhaps you were just so prepared that you gave us all the information that we needed. Well, if we don't have, there we go.
Hi.
Hi, Whitney.
My name is Whitney Russell. I'm currently working in Texas, but I had just moved from Mississippi, and I've been doing research on Mississippi's history with this 19th Amendment. I was wondering if there were if there was information in the exhibit that talked more about kind of what you were talking about with the split between going for state suffrage versus national suffrage. I know in Mississippi and other parts in the South, the idea of states' rights and wanting to limit federal government was a big issue with them when it comes to working through the suffrage movement. Does the exhibit talk about things like that, where it's not, there's also a gender issue and a race issue, but then there's that third underlying issue, which is about, you know, who has the right to give us the right to vote.
Yes, and so I certainly touch on it in Rightfully Hers. You know, the women's suffrage movement is, you know, different in every single state. So even trying to do like just like a regional look was really wasn't really something that was feasible. But the important piece of this is that the suffrage movement was not just this like national effort. It was also, you know, very localized at the state level, and even, you know, in some instances at you know, the county or town level. So, you know, I had a huge tall order just to kind of hit all of kind of like the organizing that was happening at all those levels. So yes, and I kind of brushed past it in my presentation when I was talking about, you know, so it's also hard, especially because when you're talking about, you know, there certainly were like pro-suffrage women in the states that supported a constitutional amendment. There were others that were pro-suffrage who, you know, but also advocated that they wanted to be enfranchised by their state, not by the federal government. And it was a little difficult. And since I was not able to kind of address, you know, women's suffrage battles at like each state level, there's a section of the exhibit, and often race was intertwined with in particular, you know, this like the preserving states' rights kind of piece of this. So there's a section of the exhibit that I look at the kind of spectrum of the ways that race and kind of, you know, arguments that are, you know, intertwined with issues of race, kind of how that plays out, and kind of, you know, from the gamut of, you know, pro-woman suffrage federal amendment to, and actually the postcard from Georgia kind of is the other end of the spectrum, like opposed woman suffrage, and you know, in particular, you know, in order to maintain white supremacy. And kind of in between, it kind of looks at, you know, I look at the different ways that, you know, states' rights arguments come into play, you know, and also, you know, how that interacts with racism. So like you know, I had to kind of keep it pretty high level, and you know, this is where the National Archives records also best tell the story of that fight at the federal level for a constitutional amendment, because, you know, we're the repository of the National Archives. So hopefully there is a, you know, my hope is that most states were, you know, doing kind of their state's history on this women's suffrage, you know, the centennial of the 19th Amendment as well. So Whitney, you may want to look and see if like the, you know, the Mississippi, you know, I don't know if it would be the Secretary of State or whatever the kind of state historical office, if they have any information for you there as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else? All right. First of all, I would like to thank the Eisenhower Foundation for supporting our public programs. The 2020 public programs were funded through a sponsorship with the Union Pacific Foundation, and I'm very thankful to both entities to help us with our programming. We have some upcoming programs. Our next book talk is going to be November 10th at 7 p.m. The book is To Hell and Back, and Jeff, who is on the call right now, will be leading us. Jeff, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
To Hell and Back was written by Audie Murphy, who was the most decorated soldier in World War II. They also made a movie out of it. After the war, he became briefly a movie star. It's pretty intense. It's pretty good. I'm looking forward to the book talk.
Thank you for that. We're looking forward to it too. We actually, just so you recognize, we don't plan any programming in December because we're all busy doing family things. And so our last public program is at the beginning of November. So I can't believe this year is coming to a close. I hope you join us in November for our book talk. And at that time, we'll be presenting some of next year's programming as well, at least all of our books. Our books are planned for next year. Excuse me. So Corinne, let me take just a moment to say thank you. Thanks for being here with us. This virtual platform has been fantastic for us to talk to people who aren't here in Abilene with us. Thank you so much for sharing. And to those of you with us today, thank you for coming in and visiting with us. I hope to see you at one of our future virtual programs, or even better, maybe here in Abilene one day. Thank you very much. Everyone, have a great day.